Good evening. My name is Bill Legend. I had a guest scheduled for tonight to speak about their experiences with parental alienation, but we're in different time zones. So he has not entered the studio yet, so I am just going to start here and wait to see if he joins. If he doesn't join, I will be happy to answer or try to answer any questions that anyone might have about their situation or about this process. Um, I'll share some of my experiences for dealing with this process. Today, for example, um, I had a phone session with a psychiatrist who I've been referred to. Hey, how you doing?
Did I get my timing wrong? Is it starting now or in an hour?
It is starting now. You got your timing wrong.
I'll be there. I'll be on in 2 minutes.
All right, thank you. Okay, so apparently it was a timing issue. He thought it was an hour from now. Just called me, and he should be joining us very soon. As for me, I've been referred to a psychiatrist. And, I spoke with him today, and he asked me, "What do you want me to do? How can I help you?" I said, "Well, I think from PTSD, complex PTSD, or legal abuse syndrome." He kind of laughed at me and said, "Legal abuse syndrome isn't a DSM-5 diagnosis." It is a DSM-5 diagnosis, and a friend of mine has been diagnosed with legal abuse syndrome, and they are currently on long-term disability from the abuse they've suffered. And uh, everyone involved, child protection, police, RCMP, very abusive system, and they work together, telling the truth about their story. Here, well, in my case, it's been 7 years since my journey and in the world of parental alienation, and I still have not had the opportunity to present evidence. Evidence that I've provided in the court in the form of an affidavit has been ignored and dismissed. So this is this is how the process goes, and pretty traumatic situation. I said last week the experience of my life was being separated, kept from. I live with her every day that point shared custody. My custody and access has been very numerous times on false allegations. So I live with that for every day. Now I guess Mike just here, so I'm gonna onto the screen here. How you doing, Mike?
Hey, Bill.
How's you doing?
I'm good. How are you?
Not too bad. Too bad. All right, so I've already started. I've been talking about myself for a few minutes here to pass the time. Sorry, we got the time zones a little mixed up there.
Yeah, my bad.
All right, so why don't you share a little bit of information about you, your background, your history, your story? Let us know a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, so I'm Mike. Hi, everybody. Originally from England, came to Vancouver in 2013. Found a job here that I really liked, which I still do now. So settled in Canada. Um, I single when I moved here, and then sort of within a year of being based in Vancouver, met who is now my ex-wife. We had pretty much a sort of whirlwind romance. Things moved very quickly, and within a year of meeting her, I was married. with a young daughter. So things moved super quick.
Rather fast, but it's consistent. That's
Madly in love, or so I thought at the time. Um, and yeah, super happy. Um, my family were happy, and although they were far away, they were very involved as well, and so everything was, felt pretty good. But it wasn't long into my marriage, or really, it wasn't long after my daughter arrived on the scene that sort of cracks started to appear in the relationship. Um, primarily in terms of sort of the ability of me and my ex to communicate, and also her, well, between the two of us, kind of like things got very emotional quite easily in our relationship. So when disagreements arose, they would explode, and there'd be lots of shouting and screaming on the part of my ex, and lots of I would say sort of capitulation, apology, groveling on my part. I think because of the very strong emotional attachment I had to my partner, I never, and because of the kind of the depth in which I was involved with her and with my daughter, I never really questioned. Never really questioned it. I just assumed, okay, the relationship's difficult, but we'll get through it, and I'll do what I can to make sure that my partner is happy, that she's happy, that she's that I'm responding to all her concerns. And the concerns and the criticisms came thick and fast in our relationship, and it very quickly became quite overwhelming for me.
if I just want to stop you for a second because the term you used, capitulation, that's might be used more frequently in the UK or in Europe, but it's not used that often here in North America. And I'm familiar with the term because I use it quite a bit myself for trying to deal with my ex, or for people trying to deal with these type of personalities disorders that need to control everything. There's no common ground with them. You need to agree with them and agree to their terms, or there's it's it's just total chaos. And that's what capitulation means. It's you're not really agreeing with the other party, but you are willing to do what they want, so you don't have to fight. It's you're basically surrendering, and this is a form of manipulation and coercive control. And you probably weren't even aware that this is a form of abuse, according to the Domestic Intimate Partner Violence Act, that is now starting to be recognized around the world. New Brunswick has an Intimate Partner Violence Act. The UK is redefining their label of domestic violence and intimate partner violence, and this is a form of that violence, being forced continually give in to the hands of your spouse or your partner. So, sorry, I don't mean to take away too much, but that's not a common term, and I wanted to make sure everyone understood what that was. So,
Yeah, thanks, Bill. And I think when you said didn't necessarily know about it, and there's two sides. Capitulation can be conscious, where you understand, oh well, I don't agree with this, but for the purposes of keeping the peace, I'm going to go along with it. And in some cases, you don't even want to raise it that it's an issue, you know, to keep the peace.
part of the conditioning of being in a relationship with a person with that behaves in this manner. It's what you described. Your torrent, how you quickly got together, ended up getting married, having a child. That's sounds a lot like love bombing, which is one of the phases of a relationship that these people with these disorders, such as narcissistic or borderline personality disorder, behave like, where they try to gain your trust and control, and there's a cycle of denigration and rejection, and it's there's four phases of the cycle and it repeats consistently. So this love bombing is a greater part of this cycle at the beginning. To later on in the relationship, it's almost non-existent, and then there's basically just three cycles. And all you're looking for is to maintain the cycle where everything's calm and quiet, so there is no fighting, and that's how people end up getting into these situations. So, how long did your relationship last?
Um, 4 years approximately.
So, again, 2, 5, 7 years. Mine lasted 7 years, and it was a struggle the whole time. And it will be a struggle because, like you said, you try to do everything you can to please the party because they keep telling you everything that's going wrong between the two of you is because of you and what you're doing, and you're not acknowledging how I feel, and you keep disregarding how I feel. They use
So
guilt and shame.
yeah, and the thing is, I've been on a journey over the last year where I've through a huge amount of support, and I can talk about later where that came from, that I understand this now. So I've read about it, I've been told about it, I've experienced it, and now it's all, I understand it. But if you take me back a year when I was, or a year and a half maybe, when I was in the thick of it, I didn't understand any of it. I didn't even understand that these kind of personality orders existed. I certainly didn't understand how, different forms of intimate partner abuse manifest themselves. Um, and so this sort of like lack of knowledge and lack of experience of these kinds of situations, it just meant that I was wrapped up in it and not self-aware and not really aware of what was going on, to the point where I wasn't challenging it. I wasn't that there was no kind of like self-awareness or third person perspective on what was going on. Is incredibly stressful for a long time, as I'm, the feeling is like treading water, trying to maintain a relationship, trying to keep somebody happening. It doesn't matter what you do, you're slipping further and further down, and you're exhausting yourself. That's the feeling that I equate it to.
I like your analogy of treading water. That's a really good one. I described the situation, everything I went through with the police, the courts, child protection as an avalanche. Um, Someone lied, and that lie snowballed into an investigation by the police, by child protection, criminal charges, restraining order, court appearances, me losing custody of my children, just the whole thing. It was just overwhelming. And I had done nothing wrong, and all I wanted to do was to have my time with my children. I didn't want to fight. I didn't want to argue, and he had left the our marital home. There was no fighting and arguing because we weren't together, and so it still continued even though we weren't together. And I think that there's what people don't realize. So, how did your situation progress after? How did you end up separation? Is and how did everything go? What took place?
For me, there's an event horizon that occurred for me um, in July of 2020. Is that right? Yeah. Um, so leading up to that time, my ex had for about 6 months been talking about wanting to separate, but it would come in waves. So one day she would want me out the house, and then 2 days later she would be talking about going on holiday or buying a car. And then the next week she would be screaming at me to get out. She never want to see me again. And in the context of having a child in the family, my attempt was always to try and kind of like flatten that wave and say, well, where are we really, and try and take off the peaks and take off the troughs and say, really, where were we? And I never got to the point of saying, and I think there was, looking back, certainly an element of denial on my side. I never got to the point of saying, yes, we are separating, we are breaking up. And then, so during this kind of like very uncertain, very tumultuous time, my ex met somebody through her work, started spending time away from the household. That turned into nights away from the household over a period of a couple of months. Always, nothing ever said about meeting somebody else. It was always, there were always other reasons. And then at the same time, my ex started saying, well, I need to find somewhere else to live. It needs to be close. And I sort of started this slow process of accepting the very basic fact that we were moving into two houses. But also going through a lot of the emotional turmoil of the relationship ending and my ex basically, moving in with another guy and talking about wanting to break up. So there was this kind of difficult period. And ultimately she did move out into her boyfriend's place, which was on the other side of town. And then we had a sort of like loose arrangement where she said she wanted to have our, for our daughter to be with her at the weekend, because at the time she was working full time, 5 days a week, as was I. And things just deteriorated. And her behavior became more extreme and more erratic and more angry, just a huge amount of anger. And every time that she would often come back to the house, because a lot of her things were still there. She moved out in a very informal way, bit by bit, taking some clothes, coming back, having a storming argument, grabbing some more things, and disappearing for a few days. And we were at the point where she was just coming back sporadically. Very difficult to know where she was when she was coming back. She would arrive in the middle of she'd just arrive without warning and be shouting and screaming at me and grabbing things, throwing things. And this was at the time because we'd had this arrangement where I was looking after my daughter during the week. Typically my daughter was in the house when this was happening as well. So there would be these storms where she would come in, she would want to see our daughter, she would be grabbing things, she'd be accusing me of things, and it was just completely out of control. And I was I'd already sort of sought some help, and I was in contact with Pathways family coaching, who some people might recognize, Monique Mason. And so I'd started a dialogue with her where she was starting to open the door and saying, you know what, like, this is what's happening, Mike, like, be aware of it, and also be careful. And that was when I started
So
to realize the situation I was in.
I think that's how you got referred to me, is through Monique. She thought I might be able to help you with navigate the legal process in the family courts there. And I don't know that I was able to help you, but I continue on, because people that are going through this, they need help because they really don't understand what they're going through. And everything you've described about her behaviors, that's kind of, are you familiar with the term Stockholm syndrome?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I
Okay,
am now.
Stockholm syndrome
Yes.
was people were uh, held hostage by terrorists in Sweden, and I think during a week period, um, through emotional manipulation, like what you were just describing, where there'd be threats and screaming, and made to cause the person to be fearful with intermittent positive reassurances or emotional contact, that they would develop strong bonds with their captors, to the point where when rescuers were coming to try to save the people that were being held hostage, they were standing up and trying to protect the terrorists who held them hostage for a week. Um, and that happened over a very short period. And these were adults. These were adult people who ended up trying to protect the people who were abusive to them, because they learned how to manipulate them by being abusive but showing intermittent little signs of kindness to them, and trying to align them with their story of why they were there and what their cause was. And the people connected with them. And that basically is the process that happens in these relationships. and it's the same cycle, same process. But in people situations like you and I, when we've been in a relationship, these are people we trust. These are people that are closest to us, not some stranger who has taken us hostage, managed to manipulate us into wanting to protect them after a week. Someone we spent a long time with, and you're right. It's very confusing, very conflicting, and very hard to know what to do. You're still in that abuse until you recognize or someone tells you that you're being abused. And until that happens, you're really oblivious that it's happening. Yes. I don't mean to cut you off. I just everything you're describing is so consistent with all these things, and it's the everyone goes through the same pattern. And sorry to break you off there. Let's keep
Yeah.
going, please.
Well, I just comment on that is that, you know, during that time, she would arrive and be screaming and just reams, just like rolling over all of the things I'd done wrong, um, all the reasons why I'd caused her to leave, why she had to get away from me. And then, you know, there would be, might be another time she'd come in and she would be like, you know, I miss you. This is hard. I miss you, Mike. And so you're absolutely right. It was completely disorienting. And um yeah, now having been through all this, and now I'm very, very comfortable with the idea that I don't have any control over her behavior. But at the time, I was not, I didn't understand that, and so that it was completely overwhelming for me, and not knowing one day to the next really what was going on. The level of just unpredictability in her behavior and her mood was just off the charts. So I was in a very sort of stressed place, and just, you know, finding just the day to day really, really difficult. um One of the things I did, which at the time I was worried about doing, but ultimately I think it helped me, was I actually went and saw my doctor at that time, and I told him that I wasn't sleeping. I'd never experienced it before in my life, but I was having anxiety, really strong anxiety, um you know, physically debilitating anxiety. And so I spoke to my doctor, and he was very supportive, and he gave me like a sleeping, just a tablet just to help me sleep, and then one for just for anxiety when it was peaking. And I was nervous about taking any medication because it's not something I'd ever needed before. But ultimately, I think just giving into that and saying I need help. It was one of the ways at the time that I'm proud of myself now for recognizing that I needed the help. So I got some help with the sleeping. I got a little bit of help with the anxiety, which basically my motive was to allow me to continue to function as a father, because while all this was going on, I was conscious I still had to be there for my daughter. I was looking after her at the time, five days a week, um, with a,
At the time.
yeah, an errant mum. So that's kind of the situation I was in. And then an event occurred where my ex came back to, I'd stayed in the family home. So my ex came back to the family home one afternoon when it was ostensibly, it was my parenting time with Addie. She was in daycare. She came into the house to collect some things, and I think she wanted to take all of the kitchen, everything from the kitchen. And I think I made the comment, well, I said something like, well, do you mind just leaving a few things here? Otherwise, I'm not going to be able to feed Addie this evening. And at that point, it blew up. Um, she threatened to cut my throat. She told me she was going to file a police report. She was going to get me deported. I laugh now. So yeah, she threatened to slit my throat, and then she physically attacked me in the house, punched and kicked me, um, and wouldn't let me. And my response to that was to try and leave, and she wouldn't let me leave, so she blocked my exit. Um, Eventually, I did leave, and I won't go into too much detail about what happened, but it culminated in her leaving the house, going to daycare, picking up my daughter from daycare and taking her, and then texting me and saying that I'll never see my daughter again, that she's going to file a police complaint, that she's getting a lawyer, and that she wanted me to leave her life, whilst consecutively demanding that I leave the family home and allow her to move back in with my daughter. So that was a kind of a point in time where everything shifted, and it went from being difficult to being quite serious in my estimation. And then a few days later, then I was receiving kind of regular text messages from her, which now you would call were very clearly abusive in nature. And a couple of days after she took Addie, she made a complaint to the Ministry for Children and Families, which is the child protection services in BC, accusing me of being physically aggressive with my daughter, physically manhandling her and squeezing her to the point where she couldn't breathe, as part of my disciplining of her. So she made a report. And she used that as the reason for why she wasn't allowing me to see my daughter anymore.
Scott, one of the viewers, I posted his comment, lost my child over her allegations conflict. That's common. That's what happened to me too. While my ex was never physically abusive towards me, and neither was I towards her, and she acknowledged that in her testimony at court, the psychological emotional damage that years to even recognize what I had gone through. And here I am, almost 7 years into this process, and I'm still seeking help and trying to recover. And she is still, we were in court November 14th, 15th, and 16th on some issues I raised, mainly contempt for her failure to follow the court order. And instead of the judge dealing with any of the issues that I raised, he was more interested in listening to her say how she wanted to have the custody and access schedule to be, which she wanted the children with her full time, and she was okay having supervised visitation on the weekends. So I'm 7 years in, and everything the being accused of harming your children, I've been through it. And one of our members here that is watching tonight, he's been through it. And almost everyone goes through the same process. They've either been accused of raping their former spouse or abusing their children, or being not even so accurate as to saying what the abuse is, just saying they're aggressive, hostile, and they're fearful. That's what it is what the term is, fear. As soon as the police hear that, that gives them what they believe is grounds to go in and violate people's rights and start issuing protection orders on stories alone without speaking to the other party, which happened to me twice. I was arrested twice. They never took a statement from me either time. So I know how the process works, and it's very abusive. And in Ontario, they just passed Kira's law, where they are going to allow the police to put ankle monitors on any male that is accused of domestic violence. This is a complete step backwards in the process of protecting people that suffer from abuse. From what you're telling me and your reactions to just reliving, I can see the trauma you were subjected to and you're reliving now, sharing that with us. And I'd like to say thank you for being courageous enough to share these intimate details of your life and the trauma you're subjected to, in the hopes of helping other people come forward to let other people know that they're not alone in what they're going through and get help. there are people out there that can help you, and that's what you need. And again, I don't mean to rattle on, but thank you. Please continue with your story. It's uh,
No, thank you. And yeah, and I'm just I'm very pleased to have been invited. And yeah, I hope that just, you know, I can't share things with much structure, but hopefully just, you know, talking through things will help other people and certainly help me as well. So
yeah,
thank you. Um, yeah, so I think I was just talking about this kind of like this one event which changed everything, and I was kind of thrown into this place which was completely uncharted territory for me. No real knowledge of what to do next, completely outside my sort of sphere of experience. I think that was when I first spoke to you, Bill, because I actually the night that she assaulted me and took Addie, I had a brief conversation with Monique that evening, and she recommended that I contact the police after that event. So I did that, and the police came to the apartment, and I was it was not a good experience for me. They laughed at me. They told me I looked like I was big enough to defend myself. Why was I wasting police time? Did I want them to arrest my ex-wife and put her in jail? You know, so it was a bit of a an
these are
ordeal for me.
common gaslighting techniques that the police are employing because they don't want to deal with these situations because they don't know how to recognize them. These problems have first been recognized by the police trying to deal with these domestic situations back in the 70s by Dr. Donald Dutton, Canadian, who recognized this pattern and started creating some training courses where he trained the police on how to deal with domestic situations where partners were fighting and properly handle and deal with these situations. You're correct when you say that the police don't handle these situations properly when a man is being abused. Uh, they treat. I'm a jujitsu instructor, and it's been said in court that I can kill people like that with pressure points, just one strike and they're dead. Um, it's completely fictitious, but that's how I've been labeled and portrayed, and because of that, no one recognizes the abuse that I suffered from. I'm not a hostile or aggressive person. I've studied different martial arts because I was bullied at a young age, and I stand up to bullies now. And the family court system is the worst bullying I've ever suffered in my life, and that's why I do this, and I run the pages because not everyone can stand up to them, and they need help. I'm trying to give people the tools and the information so they can help themselves. And I do remember you contacted me, and it was just when the police were getting involved, and that's when Monique referred you to me because I dealt with these situations. And sounds like you must have had some success because you're here talking about this now. So
Yeah, and this this comes the funny bit, Bill, because I pretty much ignored your advice at that point in time. I feel bad about that. But there was a reason for it. So you'd said you not all of your advice for sure. I think you were very firm in suggesting that I make sure that it was that the events were detailed properly with the police. And I did follow up with them and spoke to the supervisor of the officer. And he did provide me with a route for making a formal complaint, and he did provide me with the opportunity to go in and make a formal statement. And that was when I stopped following your advice. um,
that's okay. Most
and,
people.
and and luckily for me, it worked out. And I think it's not to say that your advice wasn't a good advice. So your advice to me was to make sure that I did go through and make that formal complaint, to provide the evidence that I had. So I had photographs of the bruises on my body, and to make sure that they made it into the police file. And the point you were making is that this can come back at any time. If you don't formalize it, if you don't provide your evidence, then it can work against you. Um, and but the other thing that I'd done at the same time is that I'd found myself a lawyer, and just various things that were happening. I did choose at that point just to put discussions with the police to one side and to focus on the avenues that my lawyer was presenting to me to try and stabilize the situation. So that's what the next few months involved. So on the one hand was just me kind of like dealing emotionally and practically with not having my daughter in my life. That, you know, going from putting her to bed every night, being the person who was basically keeping her going because her mom was nowhere to be seen for weeks. She was with her new boyfriend until this happened. Going from being that kind of like pivotal position to as a carer to having nothing, not having nothing, just not being involved was just incredibly difficult for me. And it cuts right to the core, because I think when you've been in a difficult relationship like that and you've been trying so hard to make it work, I recognize now that you let so much of yourself fall away. You give away so much of yourself that your sense of who you are, your identity, is kind of lost to that purpose of keeping your kids safe and looking after your wife. You know, a lot of my close friends had faded into the background. And so when I was left on my own without my ex and without my child, I literally felt like I had nothing. No, I had no sense of self, no idea where to go. I felt I would walk down the street and I would feel like everyone was looking at me. And I would, you know, I would walk past a bar and there would be people out having a drink, and I could never conceive that would ever be me again. You know, it was really, really difficult experience for me. So on the one hand, I was sort of dealing with that, and then, you know, the kind of the emotional side of it, but then trying to kind of keep a clear head and look at the legal situation and try and make sure that I was acting on it. And it felt to me a little bit like a ticking clock, because I'd heard fragments of this notion that if you know, if someone changes the status quo and it goes unchallenged, that over a period of time it becomes harder and harder and harder, that basically the status quo becomes the new normal. So I was very, very nervous about that, about just accepting what had happened, and trying to work out, you know, what steps to take and so I was, you know, I was again pretty clueless, but I was doing things like I was just regularly messaging my ex and saying, just to make it clear, you know, I don't consent to what's happening. I don't agree with this. Addie's safe with me, because she was always talking about how I was a danger to my daughter. I would message her. I would try and be as polite and formal as possible, trying to stay away from letting my anger imprint itself on these messages and emails, which I already knew by then through conversations with you and with Monique. Just, you know, everything now becomes, everything has to be framed in the context of how a judge will see it. So I was no longer writing to my ex. I was writing to the judge. And I think, you know, I think that was one of the things that I did right, with help from people like yourself, was to recognize that fairly early on, and really keep my cool with my correspondence with her. So I just on a regular basis, every day or every other day, calmly letting her know Addie's safe with me. I don't agree to this change in the schedule. I'm willing to sit down and talk about it. We can use a mediator if you're more comfortable. Just things like that. I didn't really think it was going to have any impression, but I felt like that it might be a good way to be acting in the eyes of a judge. So that's how I behaved towards my ex. And then, but, you know, none of it really having any effect. It would just be met with, you know, abusive responses, accusations. The investigation with the Ministry of Children lasted 3 days. So I had an interview. They came to my house. We talked through things. I explained my side of the story and what I'd experienced over the last 6 months. And the social worker told me there and then that she'd be closing the file. But that didn't stop my ex from using it in discussions with her lawyer, and using that and pitching that angle. So eventually, after a couple of weeks, she did connect with a lawyer. So my lawyer contacted. I told her that I'd got a lawyer, gave her the details, and said that she needed to get one too. And I was lucky that she did engage with that process and she got herself a lawyer, because I know it doesn't always work that way, and there can be a lengthy kind of pursuit or, chase to get any kind of contact at all. So I was quite lucky with that, and so that really just began the legal process. And I was lucky; I had a good lawyer, and she. I would say that I think maybe British Columbia is a little bit more further ahead. The sense I get, I'm not an expert, but the sense I get is they're a little bit further ahead legally on recognizing these kinds of issues. But it started what was a year-long legal process to avoid court and to establish reasonably equal parenting schedule. The pivotal piece for me was the so we made a notice of claim. It all got really unpleasant in terms of the correspondence between our lawyers, and I was being accused of all sorts of things, approaching my ex in the supermarket and being aggressive. These things just never happened. It was just all completely either manipulated and contorted or simply just fabricated from nothing. Luckily my lawyer was able to luckily my lawyer was able to kind of effectively work with the opposing counsel to dissuade them from filing a protection order against me, although it was spoken about. So yeah, it was it's a year-long process. And the one thing that I would say is two things really. Because I'd had that early help from people like Monique and yourself, I'd been quite careful about collecting evidence of the situation I was in. Actually, even before my ex left me, on occasions when she was getting very, when she was shouting and screaming either at me or at my daughter, I'd recorded it a couple of times. So I had some audio of those exchanges from before we even separated. And then when things started getting difficult, I did start quite thoroughly recording my exchanges with my ex. So I'd accumulated quite a good number of audio recordings of our exchanges, and also, just to be honest, I was aware of this legal situation that I was falling into, but my ex was not, and she was not holding back in her correspondence with me. So she was a self-documenting machine, actually, during that period. So I had a huge amount of, text messages and emails and things that she'd written that were a testament to the emotional state that she was in as being abnormal. And so that body of evidence, the text messages, the audio recordings that I'd taken, the diary that I was keeping, that all helped me a lot when it got to the point of negotiation between lawyers, and specifically preventing the protection order, because my lawyer was able to make clear to my ex's lawyer that it would be thoroughly rebuffed if they went that way. And she would sort of drip feed bits of evidence to opposing counsel, indicating that we were in a fairly strong position in that respect. And that was effective.
What you're talking about now is you have the evidence. One of the people is asking, Are the video recordings by the children allowed in court as evidence? Now, uh, I'm not a lawyer. I have been recorded mine, and I have provided some of my evidence to the court, and they've accepted it. And I will be making more applications for them to accept many of my audio video recordings that I have. But before they accept it, they may want to have it authenticated. So you can either go to the RCMP or go to a group that provides authentication for video or audio recordings. And once it is authenticated, then the court can accept it. They may not want or need it to be authenticated, but if it is not authenticated, they can disregard it and say they don't want to look at it. Because they have done that to me before when I've provided CDs with recorded phone calls that were very troubling to me, and I wanted other people to be able to hear it. So you just said your lawyer had it, held on to it, and kind of gave a little bit of it away at a time as a bargaining tool in your case. So you didn't end up going to trial, and you didn't need to end up providing all these recordings in testimony to a trial, then, I'm assuming.
Yeah, that's right. And there was a key kind of piece there which I haven't explained yet, which sort of sets up the reasons for that. So after reviewing a lot of that information, my lawyer's recommendation ultimately was that we make an application for what's called a Section 211 report, and it relates to the BC Family Law Act versus the federal Divorce Act or anything like that. But there's a provision in BC law that allows either party in the dispute to request a report undertaken by an expert, and there are various different versions, from a voice of the child type report, which might be done by a social worker, through to a full psychological evaluation undertaken by a registered psychologist.
Yeah.
And that was the application that we made. Sorry, the precedent in BC is that it's very rare that a court wouldn't agree to that report being undertaken. However, it is done at the cost of the complainant, of the claimant.
There is a case from British Columbia. It's the story of a boy called X, where a boy was allegedly being alienated against his mother by the father. So they brought in 5 specialists, Dr. Stephen Miller, Amy Baker, Kathleen Rea, who is Canadian, and then there was 2 others. There was 5 in total. And 4 of the 5 experts agreed that alienation was taking place. The 5th expert said, the boy is happy when he's with his father. He's not happy when he's with his mother. He should stay with the father. So this was the professional who did his assessment, and that's the assessment he provided to the court. Well, Dr. Stephen Miller's, Kathleen Reyes, and Amy Baker's were much more thorough and recognized attachment pathologies, and it was very well written. And again, I'm not a psychiatrist or psychologist, but I've followed their work, and it was very thorough and very detailed about the process that was happening that they recognized, and they agreed. 4 of the 5 professionals agreed that this child was suffering from a course of controlling and manipulative behaviors, which caused him to reject his mother and his sister. So it does happen, and that is what you need. A voice of the child done by a social worker is like having a nurse take a look at you for a heart attack. You're going to die because they don't know how to treat you because they're not qualified. This is you need the clinical, somebody with the qualifications and expertise to recognize the situation they're dealing with. And that's probably why you got the settlement, because if it had gone that way and was recognized, That's a medical diagnosis, and it just can't be refuted. So that would have put the nail in the coffin, let's say, for this case.
I'm very fortunate. I count myself as very fortunate, and I want to acknowledge that I'm sure there are many people out there experiencing the kind of thing that I've experiencing that aren't as fortunate as me. Firstly, that aren't fortunate to live in British Columbia that includes these provisions within family law, and secondly, that I was fortunate to have people who could support me financially and pay for the report. It's without that support, I can't tell you where I would be. Who knows? Yeah, it might be fine. It might be that I was significantly further back in the process that I am now. So just to recognize how fortunate I am. But yeah, I think as you'd started to say there, Bill, that the outcome was, the psychological evaluation. It wasn't a medical. It's not a medical diagnosis that they gave in my case, and a lot of it depends on the practitioner. But the report, I mean, it was a long document. We both basically had to do an affidavit. My wife's affidavit was 40 pages of kind of history of accusations, which I had to go back and kind of like forensically respond to, paragraph by paragraph. There was about a month of late nights, me just to her affidavit. So it was kind of similar to a trial process in a way. We had to, and I submit as part of that report process, the Section 211 report. I actually submitted a whole set of materials which would be similar to what I would submit for a court case. So it's a very extensive and thorough process. I was able to put forward my perspective, my story, and also provide a lot of the evidence that I'd submitted to my lawyer, including some of the audio recordings. So the assessor, the psychologist, was able to review those, and they formed part of the report. And the basic outcome of the report was a recommendation for for shared parenting. However, he also recognized I think I have to be careful what terms I use, but he referred to my ex as being, what did he say? Basically, highly emotionally volatile. And he pointed to some specific examples where he had ongoing concerns. And so the other recommendations of the report were that my daughter be basically kept in a counselling program long term, effectively to be able to deal with the emotional demands that having a mom like her mom are going to place on her. But also critically, it recommended that I had decision-making authority on guardianship issues. This was, I don't like to talk about winning and losing because nobody's winning from any of this, but ultimately legally that was a win for me, because it was quite likely, if we went to court, that the outcome of a trial would, using this report as a basis, and it's very rare that the court ignores a report of this kind, that would be the outcome. And to avoid court and to avoid a trial, I went through 3 months of very, very careful and considered negotiation to get to a point of settlement. And that point of settlement was not a 50-50 parenting schedule, because that was not going to happen. I was not going to get that agreement. It would have gone to trial. And foregoing having decision-making authority and putting that in the hands of a parenting coordinator. So those were two concessions that I chose to make in order to get a settlement that gives me what I think is actually a very good parenting situation, which I'm now living and is working.
I'm very happy for you. Even in situations of alienation or high conflict divorce, most professionals agree that joint shared parenting is the best model, where the two parents adopt a parallel parenting instead of trying to co-parent, because there's never going to be any meaningful communication between the parties, because one tries to engage in conflict at every chance possible. So the only way to avoid this conflict conflict is to not have communication with that party. Any communication needs to be minimal and strictly about the situations being dealt with. So I'm happy that you have got some resolution to this case. So how old is your daughter now?
She's 5. Sorry, Bill, I missed that.
How old was she when this process began?
3.
So she's 5 now. The good thing is you've now got a stable custody and access agreement. You're probably not having the fights like you were at the beginning of this process, and things have normalized a little bit better now. And that's very healthy for even if you're separated, for the two parents to be separated instead of being in a toxic environment, raising the child and being at each other. That's the worst environment to raise the child. So I'm happy that you're happy with the outcome of your case. I'm happy that you still get to see your child, because a lot of people that go through this that don't have the evidence to show that they weren't the abusive party end up getting railroaded. So I'm glad that you're happy with. I'm so glad for you. And how is your daughter doing now? You must see a difference in her behavior now from the beginning of the process.
Yeah, there was a period of time where her behavior was quite difficult, and it was obviously like a stress response. And she had a diagnosis in that regard as well. But she's doing much better. Yeah. I think probably as much as you could hope for from a child who's been through what she's been through. She's happy. She's very, very aware of, like, emotionally aware of the dynamic now. For a while, I think it was very disorienting, but she gets it now. She knows that her mom and her dad have very different ways of seeing things. It's probably quite hard work for her to navigate that difference, but over time, you definitely see her adapting to it. And the more that she adapts to it, the less of a burden it becomes on her, and the more she's able to just be a kid, which is what every parent wants for their 5-year-old. So, yeah.
Well, I'm so happy to hear that, and we've been on almost an hour, and we usually just cut it off after an hour. Again, I'd like to say thank you for taking the time. I'm glad you still remembered me, and you get back to me after all this, and you wanted to share your experiences, because honestly, your story isn't that different than anyone else's. The process starts the same, and yours sounds like it has a pretty good ending. Like I said, 7 years into my process, I'm still fearful of losing my children every day, and you seem to be out of the court system now in a period of 3 years. So good for you. I'm very happy for you, and I hope that you can stay out of the courts and continue to be a parent to your child, and your child gets to see both parents and has a healthy relationship with you both.
Well, thank you to you, Bill, as well, because you were there at a very important time for me, and I won't hesitate to say that it made a difference, as did just having opportunities to speak to people who've gone through a similar thing. So that's why I'm here. And it's not to say that I'm out of the woods completely. I'm still scared on a daily basis. Who knows, but just to say, yeah, things are steady now. I'm very grateful for it. I know that I'm lucky to be where I am, and I'm very grateful to you and to everybody else who's supported me to get at least this far. And I just want to acknowledge everybody who's listening in, and to those people who are still, maybe stuck in the mud, just to, you will get there. You will get through it. It's almost unimaginable when you're in the thick of it, but you will get through it.
Bringing it up to the support you have. For anyone going through this process, you can't do it alone. You need help. You need some people that understand this process. They can really understand what you're going through instead of why didn't you do that or how come this is still going on, which basically makes you feel like you've done something wrong. And really, people that are going through this process are victims of abuse. And being by this, people react emotionally and erratically. And I'm. You said how your friends drifted away, and that's part of it. They don't, if they don't understand the process, and they're not just supportive. They're trying to be supportive, but not realize that they're really making you feel worse by saying the things they do, which makes you less likely to want to talk to them or spend any more time with them. And the same for them because they don't know how to make you feel better and they feel bad. So it's a very difficult situation to navigate, and you're going to need to find people that understand what you're going through and not actually trigger you by asking you questions that make you feel like this is your fault because you've already been in a relationship where that's how you were treated. And while that is not their intent, they're trying to be positive and helpful. Um, this is what I found from my experience, and maybe you as well, is while they're trying to be helpful, that they're really making you feel like you're the one that caused all this. It's not your fault. Going through this, you be aware that you didn't ask to be abused. This is a process of abuse, and you need help to recover. It takes a long time to recover. There's help stuck there, go in a circle, and not really go anywhere, and you'll just end up, like you said earlier, you lose yourself and all sense of worth and value. It's hard to even cope or manage on a day-to-day basis with what your life has become. So anyone that's out there, you're not alone. Mike, thank you very much for taking the time and sharing your story and your information with us. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Bill.